Greetings, students. Welcome to this recording that will give you the basics of conducting a journal critique for cross-sectional study. This is the documentation that you have in your folder that I will be going through line by line to give you guidance. I will also be referencing specific articles to give you examples of things that I will be referring to. The journal article I will be referring to is this article here, Occupational Factors Associated with Obesity and Leisure Time, Physical Activity Among Nurses. This article is also posted on your folder here under cross-sectional study, and these are all the articles that will be made reference to throughout the process of the different recordings, but this one applies to this recording for the cross-sectional study. So let's get started. First question, were there fewer than 50% of eligible persons who participated in this study? If not, then this raises the concern that the population did not adequately represent the target population. So let's take a look at the study and see whether this was the case. So let's look at the method section, specifically the study design and participant section. You will see that a total of 526 nurses responded. 394 nurses were eligible for the analysis in the present study, and excluded were 102 retired or not working, 14 currently on disability leave, and 11 employed less than a year. 3 had a lot of missing data, and 2 were missing data on BMI and physical activity, and they were excluded. This is out of 2,000 nurses who were randomly selected from a list of actively licensed nurses, and only 526 responded. And then from there, they removed those who didn't meet the exclusion criteria. So in looking at this, we can see that 2,000 nurses were randomly selected from a list, right? They were randomly selected from the list, and only 526 responded out of a total of 2,000. Now, this is going to be a crude estimate because, we don't know whether of these 2,000, how many would have met the, the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, because they specifically wanted to remove retirees, those who are on disability, based on the research question they were looking at. But at least we can say that out of 2,000, only 526 responded, and so what percentage is 526 of the 2,000? Okay, so 526 out of the 2,000, let's do a quick calculation here, is about 26.3%. So 26.3% of the population are the people who were, of those who were eligible, what percentage actually responded? Is this number under 50%? Yes, it's under 50%. And so we can point to the fact that this might raise problems with regards to the representativeness of the population of those who were actually eligible. 50% of those who were eligible, less than 50% of those who were eligible actually responded. Now, as I said, it's a crude estimate, but we can work with that in the context of critiquing that there's the possibility that the 26% is not representative of the 2,000 who were actually randomly selected. They were actively licensed nurses, and so, give or take, there may be issues with regards to representing the totality of the nurses, the totality of the characteristics of the nurses in California. The next point, were inclusion and exclusion criteria developed prior to recruitment or selection of the study population, and were the same criteria used for all subjects involved? Looking at the study, indeed, the criteria appear to be consistently used. There's no area where we are told explicitly that the criteria changed, and so we are confident that the criteria were kept consistent. They excluded retirees, they excluded individuals who were on disability leave, and excluded individuals who were employed for less than 1 year. Question 3. How was the data collected from the participants? So let's turn to the article. Okay. How was data collected? So in looking at the study design section, we can see that mail surveys were sent here. And so individuals had to fill out the survey via mail. Some respondents were also given an option of an online completion. Okay, so they used 2 data collection approaches: sending mail surveys and using an online approach to gather additional data. So let's look at Depending on the data collection method, the study may be prone to several types of bias. So, looking at what would be the potential for interviewer bias as well as reporting bias based on a mail method of responding to surveys or an online method of reporting to surveys. You can respond to this in several ways. One, again, because your task is to defend whatever approach you present, as long as it is grounded in fact. One could point out to the fact that looking at the surveys, let's dig a little bit deeper. It doesn't state that the nurses were required to provide information about their personal information. So they, and let us see here. So we can assume that if someone is sending you something to fill out either via mail or via an online response, and at no point were the nurses asked to provide their information, it doesn't explicitly say that it was anonymous, but we can point to that this was not an in-person assessment, and that the fact that they had to fill it out at their own pleasure may actually make them respond more accurately to your questions. If you look at the research question, which I'm hoping you did earlier, is that this study was concerned with looking at how occupational factors of the nursing as a profession can affect obesity and leisure time activities. So they were asked to fill these questions. Asking people about their level of activity and level of obesity isn't very invasive, and so we can say that, hey, there's nothing that we can point to that suggests that these individuals could have potentially reported information in an inaccurate way. They were allowed to fill this information on their own pleasure, and from the information provided, there was no personal information requested of them, and so that even provided additional protection for the nurses to provide even more open responses. You could defend your logic that way and say that that was an advantage and assisted in reducing, minimizing bias. The flip side of this is that mail surveys, the fact that they were combining two data collection techniques could be pointed out to be a problem because it's inconsistent, right? You have individuals who are, while it helps people complete the data, online surveys may be a little bit, depending on whether the survey was designed well, online surveys may present differently than mail surveys. So people filling out mail surveys may be more frustrated because it's just paperwork to fill out, whereas online surveys may actually be easier to take. And so you can point out to inconsistencies in the data collection processes as potentially affecting how people respond to the surveys. So, but that's also a point that you could choose to raise if you wanted to. So all these points can be addressed under how the data was collected. We talked about the fact that the surveys were done at home, at the pleasure of the participants. That's an advantage because people can provide responses with ease rather than being in front of research study personnel. Secondly, you could point out that no personal information appeared to be collected, and so people could have been more willing to provide responses. Thirdly, you could point out to potential weaknesses in the fact that the data was collected using two approaches. Some were online, some were mail surveys, and so and they actually didn't provide more details on how the surveys looked. And so the online survey may have looked and appeared to be a much easier, shorter process compared to the mail survey, and that could have affected the nature of how people respond. Because with mail surveys, you just want to flip pages and continue to place responses, whereas an online survey, depending on the participant, may have been providing responses with ease. You could address either of those. Number 4, well, outcome measures and exposure measures assessment methodologically sound. And here we can also add covariates measurement, because it also affects the study, not just how you measure the outcomes and exposure, but also how you measure your covariates. So let's take a look at the study itself to see what we can find. Looking at the study, you will see that the exposure variable, I'm reading from the abstract here, were occupational factors, different occupational factors. So there are multiple exposures. And they wanted to see how these occupational factors affected obesity, as well as leisure time physical activity. What were the covariates that were collected? Let's turn to table 1 to give us an idea. Table 1 gives us a description of the participants. We can see we collected age, gender, race, education status, comorbidities, body mass index, aerobic physical activity, muscle strengthening physical activity, type of workplace. So all these variables were collected. How were they collected? They were collected via self-report largely, right? There was no objective measurement of these variables. So we can point to weaknesses in using self-report as a measure of these covariates, and we can state that those were weaknesses and that could point to misclassification bias for these specific variables. So here, misclassification bias could be of the outcome, because the outcome was obesity and leisure time activity, as well as covariates. The occupational factors were more professionally related. And let's just turn back to so that I can show you what some of these factors were. Type of setting, job title, or work status, how many hours per shift you work, how many hours per week. So these were more factual information, and there's no reason why somebody would potentially self-report these in an inaccurate way, because these are factual things related to their job. However, when you look at the obesity and leisure time activity variables, you could make a stretch and say, look, physical activity, people don't keep track of their physical activity on a day-to-day basis, especially if they're inactive. And so the potential for reporting bias, and in so doing, problems with misclassification bias can also result. So you can weave a thread that way and say, hey, the measurement of the obesity and leisure time activity was prone to reporting bias, and therefore that could lead to misclassification bias, and that could potentially affect the results of the study. So these are all outcomes as well as covariate variables that could have had potential misclassification. The next point, was there bias due to unadjusted confounding? This point is usually looked at from two perspectives. One, was there a regression approach used, specifically a multiple regression approach used in the analysis that allowed for you to control for confounding factors? That's the first point. The second point would be, were there any variables that were not collected in the study that could have potentially affected the study outcome? So let's take a look at the journal article to see how these points were addressed. In the statistical analysis section, we see on page 5 that multivariable logistic regression analysis was conducted to examine the relationships of occupational factors with overweight, obesity, and aerobic physical activity and muscle strengthening activity. And this gives us confidence that there were variables that were adjusted for in the analysis. So adjustment for confounding was done, and therefore we are confident that the effect of confounding was minimized by use of this regression analysis, as we have mentioned before. Also looking at the study variables that were collected, is there anything that wasn't collected in the study that could have potentially affected the outcome of, let's go here, affected the outcome of obesity and leisure time activity? I didn't see any dietary information collected here, and so you could point to that as a potential source of bias in the study, because if we didn't keep track of the nurses' dietary habits or collect that information, we wouldn't be able to adjust for it and control for it in the study. Next, if the cross-sectional study used a database, were there too many missing records for a particular variable? So in this case, they didn't use a database, but they mentioned at the beginning of the study, as you recall, that there were 2 participants who had missing information and they were excluded from the study. And so we assume that the remaining participants had their data, and so this was not an issue raised. This was not an issue for the study. If the study had used a database, you would also point to missing records and point to bias due to abstraction, because you can conduct a cross-sectional study using records. But in this case, they recruited individuals physically. If the cross-sectional study used a database, was this source representative of the target population? This doesn't apply to our study because we didn't use a database. It was individuals who were recruited physically. Lastly, we have the global question that asks, is there anything else in the study that you would point to that either minimized or improved the study's ability to accurately estimate the effect of the exposure on the outcome? So as to the responses for the global question, we can take a look at how the variables were measured, and we can point to one, how occupational factors were measured. For example, if you look at how physical workload was measured, do you think this was a positive thing or a negative thing? Well, they were assessing the physical workload based on an established scale called the Physical Workload Index Questionnaire, and based on what we discussed, this would be a positive thing. And so this is other things that were done in the methodological approach in the study that encouraged measurement of physical activity to be measured in an objective way, and therefore that could be pointed out as an additional strength for the global question. And there are many other things you could point at. I'm not going to touch on all. I'm just going to touch on things that you could consider that would have improved or compromised the study's ability to be able to accurately answer the effect of the exposure on the outcome. And then the last question is about the external validity and internal validity assessment. In looking at the external validity, the study was done in California. And so one could argue as to whether this was a representative, could this study findings be applicable to all nurses? And this would not be the case. And that could be a point where the external validity is limited. As far as internal validity, one could point to whether the study had too many sources of bias to a point where you would not trust the research findings. In my opinion, based on the review, this was possibly a fair study, or you could also argue it was a good study. There were not too many holes from an internal validity standpoint, with the exception of just the fact that less than 50% of the population were represented, who were eligible, were represented in